There is a reason you stopped here. There is a reason your attention did not move past these words and instead stayed right on them. Something in you responded before you even had time to think about it. It felt familiar in a way you cannot fully explain, like a quiet pull that made you slow down. You did not arrive here by accident, even if it feels like a normal moment of scrolling or reading. Something inside you registered that this message carried meaning for you personally, even before your thoughts could organize it into logic. What you have been experiencing recently has not been as random as it may have seemed. There have been moments that felt slightly off, moments where your emotions shifted without a clear reason. You may have told yourself it was stress, tiredness, overthinking, or just a passing mood. But deep inside, you noticed that some of those feelings had a strange timing, almost like they arrived out of nowhere.
A subtle change has already been unfolding around you, and your awareness picked up pieces of it before your mind was able to explain anything. Yesterday carried a different kind of emotional weight. There was a pressure in the atmosphere around you, something that felt unusual and difficult to define. It may have come as a sudden heaviness in your chest, or a quiet restlessness that did not match your environment. It could have felt like a wave of unease passing through you while you were doing something completely normal. You might have been sitting, working, scrolling, or trying to rest, and still that strange feeling appeared without warning.
That experience was not just in your imagination. It felt real because it was emotionally real to you. At a deeper level, your mind and body can respond to emotional signals in ways that are not always obvious. Something outside your immediate awareness may have triggered that internal reaction. It felt as if your emotional state briefly shifted without your permission, creating confusion because there was no visible reason for it. There is also a reason your attention keeps coming back to a certain person or certain memory without you intentionally choosing it. When emotional bonds are strong, the mind often revisits them during moments of inner vulnerability or reflection. You may have noticed sudden thoughts of someone appearing without invitation, or a feeling of expectation that something might happen, even when nothing in your surroundings suggested it.
Yesterday, that sense may have become stronger. You might have felt an urge to check your phone repeatedly, even though you knew nothing new was coming. You might have felt a quiet anticipation deep inside, like waiting for a message that never arrived.
Or you may have experienced a moment where their name appeared in your thoughts very clearly, almost as if your mind was trying to make sense of an emotional signal it could not fully decode. It is important to understand this in a grounded way. Human emotions are deeply connected to memory, attachment, and subconscious association. When something changes in a relationship or emotional bond, the mind can react in delayed or indirect ways. You might not consciously think about it, but your emotional system still processes the shift. There are moments when emotional stress in one person can influence how another person feels, not through anything mystical, but through shared memory, strong attachment, and psychological imprinting. When someone has been important in your emotional world, your brain stores patterns connected to them. Those patterns can become active again when triggered by stress, reflection, or internal change.
Yesterday may have been one of those moments where internal emotional pressure reached a peak for the other person involved in your thoughts. They may have been going through their own inner conflict, their own realization, or their own emotional struggle. When a person reaches a breaking point internally, even if they do not express it outwardly, the emotional weight of that experience can still be felt indirectly by someone who has been closely connected to them.
This does not mean there is any literal force traveling between people, but it does mean that emotional bonds leave strong psychological impressions. When those impressions are activated again in one person, the other person can sometimes feel a reflection of that shift through memory, instinct, or emotional sensitivity. What matters most is what you felt. That sudden heaviness, that quiet discomfort, or that emotional wave that did not seem to belong to your present moment, all pointed to something shifting beneath the surface of your awareness. Your mind may have tried to dismiss it, but your body registered it first. There is also a deeper layer to this experience. Sometimes, when a connection has not been fully resolved emotionally, the mind continues to process it in the background.
Even distance or silence does not immediately erase emotional imprint. Instead, the attachment can remain active in subtle ways, showing itself through thought patterns, dreams, emotional reactions, or unexpected memories.
You may have also noticed that silence itself feels louder at times. When there is no communication, the mind often fills that gap with reflection. It replays conversations, revisits emotions, and searches for meaning in what was left unfinished. This can create a sense of inner tension, like something unresolved is still present in your emotional space. Yesterday may have intensified that feeling. It might have seemed like something inside you became more alert, more sensitive, or more aware of that connection again. Even if you tried to ignore it, part of your attention stayed connected to it. This is how the human mind works when emotional bonds are strong. It does not always follow logic or time in a straight line. Instead, it moves through memory, association, and feeling. That is why certain moments feel heavier than others without a clear external reason. You are not imagining that something felt different. You are noticing the effects of emotional connection and internal processing. Your awareness is picking up subtle changes that your conscious mind is still trying to interpret. What you felt yesterday can be understood as an emotional echo of a deeper shift happening in someone you were strongly connected to, combined with your own internal processing of that bond. When both sides of an emotional connection experience intensity at the same time, even indirectly, it can feel like a shared wave of emotion passing through distance. At the same time, your mind is trying to make sense of it in a way that feels meaningful. That is why it seems to point toward one person or one specific emotional focus. The brain naturally searches for patterns and assigns meaning to emotional sensations, especially when they feel strong or unusual.
You may continue to notice subtle reminders, moments of reflection, or unexpected thoughts related to this connection in the coming days. Not because something external is controlling it, but because your mind is still processing emotional information that has not fully settled yet.
And slowly, over time, as your internal system stabilizes again, the intensity of these feelings will begin to fade. What remains will be understanding, awareness, and clarity about what you felt and why it seemed so real in the moment. To understand why this emotional breakdown seemed to happen yesterday instead of any other day, you have to recognize that something underneath the surface has been shifting for some time. There is an invisible process unfolding in the background, something subtle and quiet, that gradually changed the emotional space between you and this person. Have you noticed how your thoughts about them suddenly became more intense, more detailed, almost as if their presence was closer than usual, even without any contact? That kind of emotional intensity is often tied to what is happening in their inner world and the release of pressure they were carrying. This was not an ordinary emotional moment for them.
It reached a peak, a point where internal pressure could no longer stay contained. It is as if this person has been carrying an invisible emotional container filled with memories, feelings, and unresolved thoughts connected to you. Every time they ignored a memory of you, every time they resisted the urge to reach out, every moment they pushed down their emotions to appear composed or unaffected, it all added more weight inside that inner container. Eventually, yesterday became the point where it could no longer hold everything. The pressure built up over time finally exceeded their ability to keep it under control. Holding on to emotional denial takes a significant amount of inner energy, far more than people realize. Pretending that someone who deeply affects you does not matter creates internal exhaustion. At some stage, that effort becomes too heavy to maintain, and the emotional system starts to break through the surface. At the same time, there may have been a subtle shift within you as well. Perhaps without consciously noticing it, you started to loosen your emotional focus on them. Maybe you became slightly more centered on your own life, your own thoughts, your own direction. Maybe the constant waiting energy, the anxious attention toward them, started to fade even a little. In emotional dynamics like this, when one side stops holding on tightly, space begins to form. And that emotional space does not remain empty for long. It creates a kind of internal imbalance that becomes noticeable on the other side. When your attention pulled back even slightly, they may have felt the absence of that emotional connection more strongly than before. While you were emotionally engaged, even silently, it created a sense of stability for them. But when that feeling weakened, their deeper emotional system responded with discomfort and uncertainty.
That response often shows up as fear, though not always recognized directly as fear. It can appear as sudden emotional discomfort, a sense of emptiness, or an unexplained internal shift. It may feel like something has changed without any visible reason. Conversations that once felt normal may suddenly feel flat or disconnected. Ordinary moments may feel strangely different, as if something familiar has disappeared. Their mind begins to repeat certain thoughts again and again, such as feeling that no one understands them in the same way, or that something important is missing. Your presence becomes more active in their thoughts during this time, not less. This is why emotional overwhelm can feel confusing on the surface. Outwardly, everything appears unchanged, but internally there is a strong sense that something meaningful has shifted.
They may have found themselves checking their phone repeatedly, opening messages they never sent, or looking at your profile without a clear reason. These actions are not random. They are expressions of inner tension seeking release. Yesterday, their emotional defenses were significantly weakened. When a person becomes mentally and emotionally exhausted from resisting their own feelings, the deeper emotional layers begin to take over. That deeper layer does not operate through logic or pride. It operates through attachment, memory, and emotional association. And at that level, there is often only one direction it moves toward: what feels familiar, meaningful, and emotionally significant. In their internal experience, you represent that emotional familiarity. Because of this, they can feel caught between two opposing forces. On one side is desire, the pull toward connection, memory, and emotional comfort linked with you. On the other side is fear, hesitation, and uncertainty about being vulnerable or reaching out. This internal contradiction creates emotional tension that flows constantly in your direction.
Even without physical interaction, this inner conflict keeps your presence active in their mind. This is one of the reasons you may have felt emotionally unsettled or unusually aware of them yesterday, as if something had changed without explanation. What makes experiences like this feel so strong is that they are not limited to thoughts alone. They often reflect in the body as well. When emotional resistance weakens, the physical system begins to respond. The mind and body are deeply connected, so unresolved emotions often show up physically. This can include sensations such as tightness in the chest, heaviness in the body, sudden waves of fatigue, disrupted sleep patterns, or waking up at unusual times during the night. These are not random symptoms in emotional terms. They reflect internal processing and emotional overload. In such states, even simple daily experiences can feel different.
Pause. The body reacts as if something important has been lost or disrupted. There is an internal sense of imbalance that is difficult to explain logically. The mind may try to convince itself that everything is normal, but the physical sensations suggest otherwise. This conflict between mental reasoning and emotional response creates confusion.
One of the most common physical reflections of this inner state is pressure in the chest. It is not necessarily sharp pain, but more like a constant weight or tightness, as if something unresolved is pressing inward. This is often linked to emotions that have not been expressed or acknowledged. At moments, they may pause unexpectedly, take a deep breath, or even place a hand on their chest without consciously understanding why they are doing it. These small actions are natural responses to emotional pressure seeking release. Sleep is often disrupted during such emotional states. They may wake up suddenly during the night, feel restless, or struggle to settle their mind again. In silence, thoughts become more dominant, and emotional memory becomes stronger. This is often when thoughts of you appear most clearly, because external distractions are gone, and the mind turns inward. The feeling of absence becomes more intense in quiet moments.
Another noticeable effect is emotional exhaustion. This is not ordinary tiredness from physical activity, but a deeper fatigue caused by constant inner conflict. Trying to appear unaffected while still feeling emotionally attached creates continuous internal strain. Over time, this drains motivation, energy, and emotional clarity. Things that normally feel meaningful may temporarily lose their impact. Even basic daily routines can feel heavier than usual.
Their perception may also begin to shift in subtle ways. The mind may start associating you with unrelated external triggers, such as faces in a crowd, familiar sounds, or even random sensory reminders. This happens because the brain attempts to process unresolved emotional attachment by linking it to external cues. It is a natural mechanism of memory and emotional association, not something consciously controlled. All of this reflects how strongly emotional attachment can shape the way a person interprets their inner world. When someone has been emotionally significant to you, the mind does not simply turn off that connection instantly. Even when communication stops or physical distance increases, the brain continues to hold patterns linked to that person. These patterns exist in memory, habit, emotion, and expectation. So in moments of silence, the mind often continues to simulate connection internally, replaying feelings and meanings that were once shared.
From a deeper psychological perspective, emotional connection is not just about physical closeness or direct interaction. It is built over time through repeated emotional experiences, shared vulnerability, attention, and meaning. Each strong emotional moment creates an imprint in the mind. Over time, these imprints form a network of associations. When something in your present life triggers even a small part of that network, the entire emotional memory system can become active again.
This is why certain thoughts can appear suddenly without warning. It is not because something external is actively sending you signals, but because your mind is continuously processing stored emotional information. When a bond has been intense or meaningful, the brain keeps returning to it in cycles, especially during quiet moments, emotional stress, or reflection. The silence does not erase the connection. It simply removes external input, leaving the internal world more noticeable. In situations like this, people often become more aware of subtle emotional shifts within themselves. A slight change in mood, a sudden wave of nostalgia, or a feeling of heaviness can feel unusually significant. The mind naturally tries to assign meaning to these sensations, especially when they do not have an obvious cause in the present environment. This search for meaning is part of how humans process uncertainty and emotional complexity.
When we describe emotional connection as something like a shared field, it is more useful to understand it as a metaphor rather than a literal force. What it really points to is the way two people can become emotionally conditioned to respond to each other over time, Through repeated interaction, the brain learns patterns associated with that person, how they made you feel, what situations were connected to them, and what emotional states were present during those experiences. Later, when similar internal states arise, the memory system can reactivate those associations.
This is why emotional reactions can sometimes feel immediate or automatic. The body and mind respond to stored emotional data faster than conscious reasoning can catch up. So when something changes internally for one person in a meaningful connection, the other person may not receive it in a direct way, but they may still experience their own emotional response triggered by their shared history and sensitivity to that bond. Yesterday, as described in your reflection, represents a moment where emotional processing reached a more active state. In psychological terms, this can happen when internal resistance weakens. A person who has been holding back emotions may eventually reach a point where suppression becomes too demanding. At that stage, emotions that were previously avoided begin to surface more strongly. This can feel overwhelming internally, even if it is not shown externally. When that happens, the mind goes through a restructuring process.
Thoughts become more repetitive, emotional waves feel stronger, and unresolved feelings start to demand attention. This is not unusual in human emotional processing. It is how the brain gradually moves stored emotional material from unconscious layers into conscious awareness so it can be understood and integrated.
For someone connected to that emotional state through memory and attachment, even indirectly, there can be a noticeable reflection of that shift in their own internal experience. Not because they are directly sharing the same emotional event, but because their mind is still linked to the meaning of that person in their psychological framework. This can result in increased reflection, sudden thoughts, or heightened emotional sensitivity. It is important to understand that the mind often exaggerates patterns when it is trying to find coherence in emotional uncertainty. When something feels intense but unclear, the brain tends to build a narrative around it. This narrative helps reduce confusion by giving structure to emotional experience. However, not every feeling needs an external cause to be valid. Sometimes emotions arise simply from internal processing, memory activation, or stress accumulation.
As emotional processing continues, the intensity of these experiences usually begins to shift. What feels strong and overwhelming at one moment often becomes more neutral with time as the mind organizes and integrates the underlying emotions. This is part of how emotional balance is restored. The brain does not remain in heightened states permanently. It naturally moves between activation and rest.
In this context, understanding your own emotional reactions becomes more important than trying to interpret external meaning from every feeling. When you observe your internal state with more clarity, you begin to notice the difference between present moment emotions and memory-driven emotions. Present emotions are usually tied to what is happening right now. Memory-driven emotions arise without clear external triggers and often carry a sense of familiarity or repetition. Recognizing this distinction creates a more stable internal perspective. Instead of feeling pulled into uncertainty or speculation, you begin to observe your emotional responses as processes rather than signals of external events. This shift in awareness reduces confusion and helps you stay more grounded in your current reality.
Over time, emotional connections that feel intense in the mind gradually settle into a quieter form. They do not disappear instantly, but they lose their emotional charge as they are understood and integrated. What once felt overwhelming becomes part of personal experience and memory rather than something actively influencing your present emotional state. This is the natural progression of emotional processing in the human mind.
It moves from intensity to understanding, from confusion to clarity, and from emotional reactivity to awareness.